What's up, everybody? Welcome back to the Pack-A-Day Podcast. I am your host, Andy Herman. You can follow me on Twitter at Andy Herman NFL. Thank you for joining me today. Today, no fluff, no beginning stuff, no news, no notes. We are just going to be talking about Adrian Amos, the Packers safety who is now an unrestricted free agent, and Green Bay will have to make the decision if they want to compete for his services on the free agent market or if they want to go in another direction. This is a player who has been, for the most part, over the course of his career, an incredibly consistent safety for Green Bay. I just recently ran a poll, as if you remember a few episodes ago. I went over Brian Gutekunst's top free agent signings, and Preston Smith, Zadarius Smith, Devondre Campbell, Adrian Amos were the top four in some way, shape, or form. And I honestly didn't know which way to order them. And I put out the poll, and it was pretty even between all four people. I think it was Campbell that actually ended up winning the poll, but all four got a significant amount of votes, or at least a pretty decent chunk of the votes, all things considered. So some people are legitimately arguing that Adrian Amos was the best free agent signing so far for Brian Gutekunst. So he's been a very good player for Green Bay, but we did see a little bit of fall off this past season, which we're going to discuss in just a moment. Now, if you haven't been following along, just remember that Adrian Amos is a free agent, an unrestricted free agent who will be able to sign with teams when free agency officially opens because his contract officially voided. Green Bay did not work out a longer-term deal with him before his contract voided, so he will, in fact, become an unrestricted free agent. Now, one of the things that we need to note here about Amos as Green Bay goes about making this decision, and as we look at whether or not it would be, really behoove the Packers to keep him this upcoming year, is that he is about to hit that unfortunate age of 30. He is going to turn 30 years old in April. And that, unfortunately, for a lot of players, maybe not some quarterbacks or long snappers, punters, or kickers, but for a lot of players, that 30 mark does become fairly significant. So Adrian Amos going to turn 30 in April and will play the entirety of this next season at age 30. As you look across the league and start looking at some of the top 100 lists for free agency, you start seeing that Adrian Amos is pretty regularly at the bottom of those top 100 lists. So he's not expected to be a top tier free agent, but he is still considered a top 100 free agent on most lists as you start looking ahead to this upcoming free agency period. So there is going to be some demand for Amos. What that is and just how much teams are willing to spend, we might have some idea, which I'll get to a little bit later, but it's going to be tough to know and gauge until we actually get through free agency and see if Amos is in high demand or if he starts having things have to play out a little bit longer and might have to take a little bit more of a team-friendly deal. That is going to be something that could play a major factor one way or the other. The other aspect that we need to look at here for Green Bay specifically is their depth at safety, because remember, Adrian Amos is a free agent, Rudy Ford is a free agent, and Dallin Leavitt is a free agent. So three guys who were on this roster just this past season are unrestricted free agents. Now, even if they bring Dallin Leavitt back as a core special teams guy, as I've talked to you before, think of Dallin Leavitt as the fourth special teams guy. You have your kicker, your punter, your long snapper, and Dallin Leavitt. There's really no plans for him to actually play safety. He's on the roster, but he is a core special teams guy. That's what he's on the roster for. So he might have that S next to his name for safety, but he's really a special teamer at heart. So that means, is Rudy Ford back? Is Adrian Amos back? If not, this is where your current safety depth chart lies. Darnell Savage, which we've talked about before. The easiest solution here is probably just that Savage is back in some capacity, but maybe they could work out something where they trade him and are able to get off of his contract that would free up additional space for Green Bay. Until I actually see that come to fruition, I would bet, I put it at like 98% chance that Savage is probably back on the team, unless he is traded in some joint trade with Aaron Rodgers. That's maybe the situation or scenario where Green Bay could get off of Savage in that situation. Other than that, I'd very much expect him to be back with the team just because those deals are rather difficult to do. And then after Savage, it's Tariq Carpenter, Innis Gaines, James Wiggins, and that's it. Save for maybe Rasul Douglas, who did get some time in training camp last year at safety. He was sort of a emergency safety for Green Bay. They did have some plans of playing him at safety in certain situations. Didn't really come to fruition all that much, but he is a player that ultimately could move to safety this upcoming season if Green Bay did want to go in that direction. So let's just say pick 15 comes around and you look at the best player available on the board and it's a corner, it's, maybe Devon Witherspoon or a Christian Gonzalez or somebody like that, those guys easily could be gone by pick 15. But let's just say one of them falls to pick 15, and Green Bay's like, yeah, that's the best player available. And they take that guy and pair him with Jair and Stokes at corner. You could see a situation where maybe Rasul kicks back to safety. So that is not entirely out of the equation. That could be something that takes place. But as of now, assuming that Rasul is at corner, it's Savage, Carpenter, Gaines, and Wiggins, which is not a ton of depth at the position. I don't think I'm breaking any news there. The other thing that we need to look at here is, as we're looking at the combine, and obviously I'm not doing a deep dive on the combine today, but the safety position underperformed at the combine. And even if you look at the position, like, it is tough to find legit safeties. Like, even a Brian Branch might just be a slot corner, honestly. Like, yeah, he could probably play some safety, but he probably is just a slot guy in the best case scenario. So, and there's a lot of safeties like that in this draft who might just be better in the slot and not actually be a true safety. So the draft isn't strong either, and Green Bay, we know, isn't going to have a ton of money to spend in free agency. So that gets us to a point where they're going to have to do something with this safety room, whether it is trying to find somebody in free agency, trying to find somebody in the draft, or maybe it is bringing back a Rudy Ford or an Adrian Amos. Now, here is the crux of why this is a situation where Green Bay may want to move on, right? Had Adrian Amos completed 2022 and come off a very solid season, we're probably having a much different discussion about Adrian Amos today. In fact, we might not even be having a discussion because Green Bay may have tried to extend him prior to his void year hitting so that he could stay on and not actually hit unrestricted free agency. They could have maneuvered that money a little bit differently. So there were some options there that just ultimately didn't happen, right? So there's a reason for that. Here were my grades. And this is since 2018. And the reason I say 2018, when he was a Chicago Bear, when he signed with Green Bay, I went through and graded every single one of his snaps from his last year in Chicago in 2018. So I have his full grade from 2018 and then his 4 seasons in Green Bay. These were his 5 years of grades that I did for Amos. Plus 6.0, plus 7.15, plus 6.0, plus 5.9 for the first 4 seasons. So like, plus 5.9 to plus 715 in all 4 seasons. Like, extremely, extremely consistent. And I said it before last season, he might be the most consistent player that I had ever seen in the NFL. Like, just constantly did his job, was always in the right place, made the easy tackles easy, like, just was sound at everything that he did. He put literally the word safe in safety. Not a big high risk, high reward guy, wasn't making a ton of plays. He was just as sound and safe and consistent as they possibly come. So just to recall here, plus 6.0, plus 715, plus 6.0, plus 5.9, and then last year, negative 3.75. A night and day difference. And if you thought Amos was really good in 19, 20, and 21 in Green Bay, well, then when I graded him well, those grades were, lined up with what you thought, right? Negative 3.75 using the same exact grader, using the same exact system this past season. A significant fall off. And you might be thinking, maybe you're not because you're here listening to me, so maybe you care about what I say. But you might be thinking, Andy, that's all fine and well, but you're just one person and your grades aren't the be-all end-all. I agree with you. I am just one person and everyone can have their biases and everyone can see things a little bit differently. So let's take a look at Pro Football Focus's grades over the last 5 seasons. 82.7, 75.7, 89.9, 74.3. So all between 74.3 and 89.9. All very good grades. Extremely consistent. Like almost the same, basically is what I had him at, right? Very similar. Then last year, 53.4. So 82.7, 75.7, 89.9, 74.3, and then 53.4. Now, clearly, PFF and I have 2 different grading scales. I grade on a per play basis and like a plus minus on each individual play. They give an overall grade out of 100, so that's why they're different grading scales there. But for the last 4 years, from 2018 to 2021, PFF and I had extremely good grades, like sound, solid, consistent grades on Adrian Amos. And then he fell off a cliff in 2022. And you might ask, well, why is that? I've said it before, to me, he didn't look a step slower. He didn't look a step and a half slower. He looked 2 steps slower. He looked like he took a significant step backwards athletically. And sometimes around that 29 to 30 year range, when you've had a lot of snaps in the NFL, that stuff starts to happen. I didn't see as a consistent or violent and he was never really like a violent tackler, but he came up and was not afraid to hit people, right? So I didn't see that level of intensity. I didn't see that level of physicality. I didn't see him screaming up to fill gaps. He just looked like he was at a point in his career where he was a step or two slower and didn't have that same level of physicality and intensity. That's what I saw on tape. And you saw it in a variety of different ways, whether it was missed tackles, whether it was not filling the right gap, whether it was not in the right place at the right time, making some mistakes in coverage, the constant miscommunications, and it wasn't just him, but as a whole in the secondary, it just wasn't good enough. And he was a player that Green Bay was extremely counting on this past season. So you saw a major fall off. And again, both from myself and Pro Football Focus saw that this past season and graded it basically the exact same way. Now, it is one thing, right? It is one thing to have a bad season. That can happen to almost anyone. If you have a lot of good seasons, basically his entire career, even before the years that I graded him, his entire career has been littered with good grades and good seasons and consistency and really sound play. So you might be thinking, if there's just one bad year in there, you just, you wipe it away and you forget it. And he probably comes back and probably goes back to the way he was playing prior to that 1 year. And for the most part, I probably agree with that, except it is paired with the age. It is paired with what I thought was a decline physically, meaning not as fast. And when you have a player who's now going to hit age 30, who has lost a step or two, and who saw a significant decrease in his level of play just a season ago, those things combined are a major cause for concern. Speed and physicality aren't the same. The play on the field wasn't the same. And now he's turning age 30. Combine those together and you have a recipe for a safety that is probably just on the decline of his career. And as much as I hate to say that, it is more likely than not the case. Would it surprise me if Adrian Amos this next season for Green Bay, for Baltimore, any other team he ends up going to, probably Minnesota or Chicago, because that's just, Detroit, that's just usually what happens, right? But whatever team he ends up going to, would it surprise me if he had a really good season next year? Or if he stayed in Green Bay, would it surprise me if he had a really good season? No. But as I talk about all the time, general manager in the NFL is about identifying risks and playing the risk-reward game. And if you see a player who has been like the most consistent player in the NFL over his entire career, and then has a massive dip, and the on-play physicality and speed takes a significant dip, and you see that calendar turn to age 30, you are betting more often than not that he has hit that, the twilight of his career. Like he is over the cliff, and now it's just down from here. That's what you're betting on. It doesn't necessarily mean that that's going to be the case, but those are the odds at this point that you are playing with. So that's what you're expecting. And I think the other thing that's worth noting here, right? Even when Adrian Amos was playing extremely good football, and you don't need to remind Packer fans, right, of how important it is to have a solid safety. Because you go back before then with the Kentrell Bryces and the, Clinton Dix in the last couple seasons of his career, and just some really, really awful safety play, right? Really awful safety play can burn you in a second. So like if you don't have at least a decent safety, you are in major trouble, right? But even when Amos was playing extremely good football, one of the knocks on him overall was that he wasn't a playmaker. And yes, he did come up with some, big plays against Chicago here and there. And, one of my favorite Packer plays over the last 4 seasons was that opening game in Chicago that he sealed with an interception. Like just phenomenal, right? Amazing moment. But in his 4 years in Green Bay, 4 seasons in Green Bay, he forced 0 fumbles. He has 1 fumble recovery, 4 sacks, and 7 interceptions. All right. A really good playmaking defensive back can get 7 interceptions in 1 season. That's not unheard of, right? He has 7 interceptions in 4 seasons, 4 sacks in 4 seasons, no forced fumbles, 1 fumble recovery. So on average, on an average season, he's basically getting you 1 sack, almost 2 picks, and that's it. Now, obviously, he's doing a lot of other things well. He's usually in his spot, doing the right things at the right time. For the majority of his career, he's been a sound tackler, right? I'm not saying that's a bad player, But we now live in the day and age of playmaking in football. You need guys who can get the ball, get turnovers, make big plays. And even in the highlight of Adrian Amos' career, that was not what he was. He was just the sound, consistent player who's going to help you win games, which I don't knock that. There's a ton of value in that. There was a ton of value in Amos in his first 3 years in Green Bay, and I loved that player. But if we're looking at investing in a player, he was not a playmaker. He was not consistent last year. Now he's, again, hitting age 30, and we're starting to see declines in his physical ability. You add all of this up, and you're like, all right, what's the upside here? The upside you're hoping is that you sign him back on a deal and he gets back to playing at the level he was at really his 3 previous years in Green Bay, that he just has a bounce back year and he's a good safety. And there's a lot of value in that. But some of the things that you start adding up together make you think, maybe that's not the best direction to go in. The other thing I question, and we always get to maybe mini camps and OTAs, and all of a sudden it comes out of oh, so-and-so player we just found out was actually playing with some really, some injury that never got disclosed the previous season, which is why he didn't play as well a season ago. So maybe Green Bay knows that Adrian Amos was playing hurt in some capacity. And you might say, well, it would have had to have shown up on the injury list or something and whatever. There's a difference between injured and hurt, right? Meaning there's probably a scenario, no scenario where Amos wasn't going to play in a game, meaning that they didn't have to designate him as questionable or doubtful or out or anything like that. He was just banged up and hurt. And it's possible that maybe he had something with an ankle or a knee or Achilles or hamstring or something that didn't allow him to play at his peak level. If Green Bay knows that, and Green Bay thinks, hey, we're probably going to get him cheaper because he didn't play as well last year, and maybe he wants to stay in Green Bay, and we think that the only reason he wasn't really good with Adrian Amos was because he had some sort of injury that he's over now, maybe Green Bay says, hey, we're willing to take a chance on that. So maybe he had some undisclosed injury or was just hurt in some way that really affected his game last year, and we just don't know that. That's a possibility too. And if Green Bay knows that, maybe that would give them some reason to maybe want to bring him back. But once again, you're also getting to that age in Adrian Amos' career where these sorts of injuries are going to start happening more and more often because of all the wear and tear that he has on his body. So that becomes a concern as well. Then the next thing becomes, all right, what does he cost? What would a free agent deal for Adrian Amos cost? Now, per Spotrac, who is not perfect with these, but their valuation of him this offseason, what they think he's going to get on the open market, is a 3-year, $20.7 million deal, about $6.8 million on average. And that is just going to be far too steep for Green Bay based on where they're at from a salary cap standpoint. And you might be thinking, and I've seen some of this on Twitter and social media, I've seen some of this in the comments of, oh, Green Bay just cleared all of the salary cap space. They have money to spend. Not true. They still have a ways to go before they have money to spend. And it's going to depend on what happens with Aaron Rodgers and all of that before we actually see what type of money they have to spend. I do believe they're going to have some money to spend, but it is not going to be a ton of money, and they can't just start going out handing out contracts that aren't making sense and that would not be advantageous. And I would very much argue that a 3-year, $20.7 million deal for Adrian Amos would not be advantageous for Green Bay, even if it was backloaded and it starts as a smaller deal up front. And even if some of that 3 years, 20.7 is funny money that never really comes to fruition, that's just that's just a step too high for Green Bay, to be quite honest, based on where they're at and based on what they got out of Adrian Amos this past season and for all those red flags that we just discussed. So could he bounce back and have a nice season? That wouldn't surprise me. Could he, get 3 years, $20.7 million on the open market? That wouldn't surprise me. Could some team get a good value at 3 years, $20.7 million with Adrian Amos on the open market if he bounces back and plays well? Yes, that is possible. It just feels like at this time for Green Bay, based on what they saw a season ago, based on those red flags that I mentioned, based on what he's likely to get on the open market, it just seems like now is the time where these two are probably set to go in a different direction. It feels like it's probably time for something new, something a little bit younger in Green Bay. And the other thing I'll add here really quick too, remember, Joe Barry wants to play 2 high safeties, all right? One of the things with 2 high safeties, depending on how you're using them, is you don't necessarily need superstar players at those 2 high safeties. What do you need? What's the job description for your two eyes? They need to be smart, like you ideally, based on how this defense plays and being able to read what the offense is doing. And we saw how important it is to be able to communicate with your secondary members around you. You need to have a good IQ. You need to have some speed to be able to, play your side of the field, get back, get forward. But I would argue instincts and taking great angles is probably a little bit more important. And more important is sound tackling and is being able to come up and fill your gap and be aggressive in the run game, because you do have two safeties high deep. So those guys need to come screaming down and make tackles in the open field. You need to be safe. You need to be the last line of defense and making sure that if you are that last guy that you're making that tackle, because if they get by you, it's over. So those type of traits, you don't necessarily need a 4.3 40 guy. You don't necessarily need somebody who is going to be a freak athlete. You just need a young, not necessarily young, but ideally a young, talented safety who's willing to come up, make the hits, is a sound tackler, and can cover his half of the field. So I do think that, paying an exorbitant amount of money to an Adrian Amos in this situation is probably not the best use of your funds based on how you're going to play your safeties in 2023. In conclusion, I love Adrian Amos. I do expect him to be gone. I do think that it's probably time to move on, and I would be surprised if he's back. He's one of my favorite players overall. The 3 previous seasons, 19, 20, 21, loved watching him play. A joy to watch play. And I legitimately hope he does well and bounces back, whether that's in Green Bay or wherever he ends up playing. I hope he has a great season. Like, he's just been a really sound piece in Green Bay. It was a really nice signing by Brian Gutekunst. But with free agency, especially when these guys start hitting age 30, it's usually just kind of time to move on. And that's, I think, what Green Bay's probably going to do in this situation. All of that being said, if Adrian Amos goes out in the free agent market and realizes that, hey, the money's not there, and I'm not going to get 6-7 million, maybe I'm closer to 4 million, right? If Green Bay is able to come back and say, hey, we're willing to do like a 1-year, $3.5 million deal with some incentives, would you be interested in that? That could maybe get you to 4.5, 5, 6 million if you hit your incentives. Okay, I'm not against that. I could totally see that working. Do I think it's probably best to, just both sides go in a different direction? I think so. But if the market's right, I'm not against it. I think he's a good player overall for this team, and I'm okay with that in that situation. But if he's looking at, closer to the 3 years, 20.7, I just don't see it. I don't think it's best for Green Bay. And like I said, I don't think they're going to do it. If all of a sudden the market's not there and Amos has to take something smaller on a 1-year deal with some incentives, then I could see Green Bay maybe getting involved. That's my overall take on Amos. Like I said, I've loved watching him play. Big fan of his work. I hope he bounces back and has a great year this year, no matter who he plays for. I just am kind of expecting that it's not Green Bay in 2023. Thanks for joining me. I will be right back here tomorrow, so make sure not to miss it. Make sure to subscribe. But until next time, and as always, go Pack Go.